Okay, 3. All right, it's good to go. Let's get started. All right, 12:30. Lord, thank you for bringing us together this bringing us together this afternoon. Thank you for the coming weekend. I pray that you would help us to get everything done that we need to this weekend so that we can enjoy some time. Help us to find some things to recharge our batteries and get after it next week better than ever. Lord, I pray it should help us get through the rest of this semester and just help us to be successful. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're doing stuff, right? What are we doing? Let's see, today we're going to talk about more stuff, right? So obviously that wouldn't work, right? So reaction equations, right? Recap. Reaction equations. Reaction forces are the result of a system that wants to be kept together, right? When we draw free body diagrams, which we went over again last class, when we draw free body diagrams, one of the steps is to remove, the first step is remove the body of interest from all of its surroundings, right? So we just have the body of interest. And that's fine, but when we do that, we have to add back in certain forces, right? We have to have the external forces, right? But we also have to have these reaction forces, right? So for example, if we were drawing the free body diagram for a wheel sitting on the ground, right? And we remove the body of interest from the environment, we're just looking at the wheel. It's no longer, the ground isn't part of the system anymore, right? But the effect of it sitting on the ground still has to be part of the system. And the effect of it sitting on the ground is the normal force. Maybe friction, if we're talking about including friction in our problem, but definitely the normal force, right? If we have, let's use the example of trusses, right? Think back to statics. If we have a truss, we can break apart these different pieces, right? And they're going to be pinned together, and a pinned connection opposes the motion, right? So if you remove one of the members of a truss and are looking at the free body diagram of that member, it's going to have the force of the weight of the beam, right? But it also has these reaction forces at the corners, right, where it was pinned. Okay, so the idea of a reaction force is that it is a force that's internal to our system that we don't necessarily see, but if we are removing the object of interest from its environment, we have to take into account the effect of the environment on that object. Okay. Another way of thinking about this is, right, if I have a free body diagram of the wheel, I can draw a free body diagram of the ground, right? And that should have an equal and opposite reaction from the wheel sitting on the ground. Okay. Equations. Well, so far there's only one equation for kinetics, or I guess two, technically. Some of the forces and some of the moments. Right? Everything that we've done and everything that we will do for the next few weeks is completely based on planar kinetics, right? Planar, meaning that it's going to happen in 2 dimensions. These are all 2-dimensional problems. And if we're doing a 2-dimensional problem, we can sum the forces in the x direction, we can sum the forces in the y direction, or we can sum the moments about some point that we're interested in summing the moments about. Any point we want. Typically, we'll use the center of gravity, but we'll show that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And you can always use the parallel axis theorem to figure out what your new J value would be. Okay. So for kinetics, we get 3 equations, right? Possible. So at most, I can ask you for 3 unknowns. If you get more than 3 unknowns, we got to find more equations. And that's kind of what we're going to lead into today. So I'm going to let that be for a minute, right? Do you guys have any other major questions that you want to go over? No, nothing on anyone's mind right now. We good? Okay. All right. Well then, I would like the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Let's try this again. Next slide, please. There we go. Very good. I'm gonna get rid of that. All right, so what we got going on? All right, homework or Learn Smart was due last weekend. We don't have anything due again until the 12th. The 12th is the day before the next exam, right? And we have a Learn Smart due the Sunday after the exam. Okay. What's going to be on the next exam? Homeworks 4 and 5, right? Homeworks 1 through 3 were on the first exam. Homeworks 4 and 5 are the material we're going to cover here. That is rigid body kinematics and rigid body kinetics. Okay, those are the two thrusts here. Okay. We'll talk next week. I think either next week or the week after the either next week or the week after the quiz, we'll start talking more about our CLCs and what's expected from the final phase of the CLC projects. Right, you guys have done all the research. The next main stuff is to build it, design it, build it, test it, and write a report about it. But we'll talk more in depth about all those things in a couple of weeks. Today, we're just going to talk about constrained planar motion. All right, so before, when we were doing problems in class, right, we assumed that these things were just 2D problems, right? But we never really said that they were constrained to have to move in 2 dimensions. Now we're going to say, without a doubt, that we have locked these things in positions that will make them only move in 2 dimensions. Right, so the reactions of an automobile crankshaft bearing depends on the mass moment of inertia, and the kinematics of the crankshaft. The forces on a wind turbine blade are also dependent on the mass moment of inertia, and the kinematics. Right, so the amount of force that we see in these also is dependent on how fast it's moving. Right, because remember, angular velocity, right, is going to contribute to the tip velocity, right? And that's going to contribute to our acceleration, and that acceleration is going to contribute to our force. And so it's all connected. So what is constrained planar motion? Well, hey, look, this system here is in constrained planar motion. Why? Because it is point B can only move up and down, and point A can only move left and right, right? We're locking it from moving in and out of the board. So the entire beam, right, this bar itself, will move in X and Y, but it won't move out of the XY plane. Because it's 2-dimensional, it can also rotate around the Z-axis, right? So that's where our 3 equations come from, right? Some of the forces in the X, some of the forces in the Y, and some of the moments about Z, or about some point G that you're interested in the Z-axis. Most engineering applications involve rigid bodies which are moving under given constraints, right? So these are real world problems, right? Your engine, pistons in your engine, right? It's not even a 2D problem, right? That's a 1D problem. It's constrained to move up and down, right? Cranks, connecting rods, non-slipping wheels are all things that we consider to be constrained planar motion. These are motions with definite relations between components of acceleration of the center of mass and the angular acceleration of the body. Right, so we can make some assertions about angular acceleration and the linear acceleration of the center of mass. Typically, when we have these types of problems with constrained planar motion, we are going to want to start with a kinematic analysis, right? So remember, we spent a couple of weeks and a homework basically doing these relative velocity and relative acceleration equations. right? And talking about how when we have general plane motion, right, we do a rotation and we have a translation and we hold that constant, right? And we do a rotation about that point. Okay? We're going to need to use general plane motion in some cases to start off by finding what is the acceleration of the center of mass, or the center of gravity of my rigid body. Then we use that, we plug that into our sum of the forces is equal to mass times acceleration. Right, so these problems take a little bit longer because you have to combine everything that we did in kinematics and everything that we did in last class. Okay, so you're not going to just be given an acceleration, you're going to have to find an acceleration given certain components, right? And we always want to find this for the center of gravity. We always want to find this for the center of gravity, right? So for example, if we're given theta, omega, and alpha, we need to find P, the normal force at A and the normal force at B, right? A kinematic analysis yields the acceleration in the X and the Y direction of my center of gravity, right? Is blue out. And then we can apply Dirichlet's principle and solve for this, right? So basically, right, what happens is you'll be given some knowledge about how this is rotating, and you'll have to use that to determine what is my translational component of acceleration, and then you plug that into Newton's second law, and you solve for those three forces, right? That's one pathway. We can talk about non-centroidal rotation. So this is if you have an object that's not spinning around the center of mass or the centroid of the object, right? So motion of the body is constrained, but it rotates about a fixed axis that does not pass through the center of mass, okay? Is this a real life thing, right? Because here I've got my potato, and instead of rotating about G, right, I'm gonna jam my axle, my rod right through the end there and make it rotate about there, right? Not really realistic. But in the real world, this happens all the time. The door. The door does not rotate, well, these specific doors on this classroom do not rotate about the center of gravity of the door, right? They rotate around the hinge. Now, you probably like, well, Dr. D, what about those doors that just continuously rotate, right? The automatic rotating. Well, that's different. That's a different kind of door, right? That certainly does rotate through the center of gravity, right? But these normal doors don't, right? So these types of problems are fairly real world, right? We can come up with a kinematic relationship between the motion of the mass center G and the motion about the body, right? So we can come up with this relationship between the rotation and the translation, right? And look, right, we know this. We know the tangential acceleration is r times alpha, and we know that the normal acceleration is r times omega squared, right? So the translational acceleration depends on the rotational components, right? The rotational acceleration and the rotational velocity. Right? Thought there was another thing there. I left a lot of space. Right? The kinematic relations are used to eliminate a tangential and a normal from the equations derived and from the method of dynamic equilibrium. So, okay, we end up with a sub n and a sub t, right? But you're like, well, I want x and y. Okay, well, then we just need to figure out what angle we are off of, right? How much is this rotated by? And we can do that, and that shouldn't be too bad. What about rolling motion, right? Rolling motion is also a type of constrained planar motion, right? So for a balanced disk that's constrained to roll without sliding, that is the same as rolling without slipping, right? And we derive this expression, right? The linear distance is equal to r times theta. So if we take the derivative of that twice, right, the linear acceleration is r times alpha. Okay. That's if we're rolling without slipping, right? So it's just pure rotation. What if I have an unbalanced disc, right? Something with a hole cut out of it. What would something like this be? Well, like a flywheel, right? Flywheel is an unbalanced disc. Typically have a hole cut in the flywheel of varying sizes, maybe multiple holes. You know why we have holes in flywheels? Because if there's a switch behind, so in certain machinery, they put switches behind them, and so when it's not on, you can get at something through the hole. Maybe not a switch. Switch is a bad example. Maybe there's a bolt or something behind the hole that you need to get at, right? It just makes way for us to get at something.
Do they ever like bolt it or things like that to influence how it spins?
Sometimes, a good question. The most common reason that you'll see gears with holes in them nowadays is for encoders. Right, so you can put an encoder on your system, and an optical encoder will flash a light through and count how many times it goes on and off, right? And it'll know based on the number of, well, it's calibrated to each of these gears, right? But it will know based on the number of times you cut off the light, what angles you've traveled through, right? So right now, encoders are the main reason. You can affect how it spins, but right, this is why we want to know, like, typically for most machinery, we try to keep things balanced, right? Because when they're not balanced, I think you can see it here with this is the best example, right? Imagine this wasn't rolling, but this was spinning around this point, right? That becomes this wonky coning type of shape, right? It doesn't have this nice smooth rotation anymore, right? And that's bad news. Another story I'll tell you about this, right? So I used to work in high school and part of college. I worked in the summers as an amusement park ride operator. Okay, I used to do the tilt-a-whirl, and it's pretty sweet. But we had a Ferris wheel at this place, right? This was like a beachside amusement park, and we had a Ferris wheel. And if you were going to operate the Ferris wheel, you needed to make sure that it is balanced. So when you load up a Ferris wheel, you don't just load it up as you go and then keep spinning it, because now you're just unbalancing it, right? You're shifting mass up higher and higher and higher, and now the balance is off, right? So when you load a Ferris wheel, you need to make sure that you're balancing it as best as possible. Okay. Right. So you try to put the same number of people, right? Try not to put you try to balance it the best you can. Okay. But in this case, right, for a geometric center of an unbalanced disk, we can say that A naught is equal to R times alpha, but we need to offset that, right? And so in order for us to find the acceleration of the center of gravity, well, this equation looks familiar, right? Because this is a point on my rigid body. Remember this equation from a couple weeks ago, right? A sub P is equal to some other point on my body. Let's call it G. Well, G is a bad one. We'll call it F. Plus A of P with respect to F. And some random point. Right? So I've got some point P on some random point on my rigid body, and I want the acceleration of it. Well, that's just the acceleration, some known acceleration plus the acceleration of this point with respect to my known acceleration. Right? That's what we're doing here. And we can break that down into normal and tangential components again, right? Normal and tangential. These are the equations that we used last week, right? We're just bringing them back. Because like I said, these problems, again, right, you're going to be asked to find forces, but in order to find the force, we're going to first have to solve for the acceleration of the component that we're interested in finding the force of. All right, So there's some special cases, right? We've got rolling without slipping, right? Rolling with no sliding. And rolling with no sliding tells us that our frictional force is less than or equal to mu sub s times n. Okay. So if you have friction that is less than or equal to the maximum friction, which is mu sub s times n, then we are going to be rolling without slipping. And if we're rolling without slipping, then this guy holds true, right? We get acceleration is equal to r times alpha, right? If we have rolling with impending sliding, so we're just about to slide, well, then my frictional force is equal to mu sub s times n, and it's the same equation, right? So that's great. And then our final case is we're rotating and we're sliding. So think about this as, I don't know if you guys have ever driven in the snow, right? But if your tire starts to spin out, right, it is rotating, but it's also slipping, right? And it's not typically not fun. At one time, so in grad school, I went home. I grew up in New Jersey. I went home to visit my parents at Christmas, and I rented a car, and it snowed really bad that winter there. I was home for like a month, and I shoveled out the driveway like 3 or 4 times. Like basically once a week I was shoveling, right? And I was going to visit some friends on New Year's Eve, and I drive out, and it was middle of a snowstorm. I just cleared our driveway. Plows hadn't come through on the side streets yet, and the car literally did a 180 as I was driving down the street, and I was just sitting there like it was like watching like a movie, right? Like person's just sitting there, and the car literally spun, did a 180, was only stopped because the tires hit flush with the curb, and then the car stopped. Some guy was shoveling his driveway, and I got out of the car, and he's like, "You okay, man?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "You want some help going back up the hill?" I'm like, "No, I think I'm good right now. We're just gonna." And so yeah, so something like that, right? Is rotating with slip, right? It's rotating, but every once in a while it loses contact with the ground, right? So it slides, rotates, slides. Unfortunately for us, if we have rotating and sliding, right? If our friction is equal to mu kinetic times n, we can't make any correlation between alpha and r times f, or alpha and acceleration, right? We cannot get any correlation between those two in this case. Most of the problems that we do, right? Most of the problems that we do end up being rotating or rolling without slipping, right? Most of the time. It's a bit easier for us to get through. Bless you. All right, let's watch a movie. Maybe. There it is. All right. We'll watch a movie.
I want to talk to you today about rolling without slipping. This is a super special type of circular motion. You see, there are 2 general classes of motion. Here's a circle, and there's translation. And we've spent a great deal of time talking about translation so far. So translation would be the center of the mass is moving. And then, of course, there's also rotation. We've just started talking about rotation, so I guess a positive rotation would look like this. The center of mass is at rest, yet there's spinning happening. I could draw both of those and draw you some velocity vectors. So there's, excuse me, there's translation, and translation looks like this. This top of the wheel or tape or whatever is moving at some velocity. The center, or the axle, if it were a traditional bike or car wheel, the center would be moving at the same velocity, and the bottom is also moving at the same velocity. Now, translation is rolling with slipping, or maybe it's not even rolling. It's you slam on the brakes and the car skids as you continue to translate the car. There's also the idea of just rotation. And just rotation, well, we can think of an example for the car with just rotation also. If we make the car wheel turn this direction, we might have a velocity there. We can even call it a tangential velocity, right? And if it's just rotation and not translation, then the axle will be at rest. So if the top is moving this way, this is kind of an obvious question, then the bottom must be moving that way. So I'm not even going to ask it. You don't get a question. There would be VT also. But rolling without slipping is a combination of translation and rotation. So what we'll get if we add up all these vectors, let's say, consider the possibility that we can make the speed of the axle, the translation part, exactly equal to the tangential speed. This will be a very interesting thing. I'm not going to draw it yet, but I want you to think about what that would look like if we added all those vectors up. So I will actually show you rolling without slipping. Here I have the roll of tape, and I'm going to start it at 0, and I would like to roll it without slipping. Da, 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 da. Notice that the bottom is stuck to the ruler. I'm going to translate it all the way around. Can you tell me if I draw a little tick mark here and a little tick mark, get off there, little tick mark right there, can you tell me how far the wheel has gone? Well, it rolled all the way around, right? And so if we draw the wheel like this, let's just draw it over here. If we draw the wheel like this, then we can identify its radius. And if it rolled this far, then we argue that it probably has rolled what? Its circumference, I guess. So this distance is 2 pi times the radius of the circle if it rolled from here to here. So if we wanted to calculate its speed, now this would be an interesting challenge. We could figure out how fast it's going by saying its velocity is equal to, well, I mean, it's simply displacement over time, right? So let's get ourselves some numbers here. The speed of the axle, and I'm actually going to label this as axle speed. If I label that as axle speed, I'm going to say the speed of the axle is equal to how far it's gone, which is 2 pi r, divided by how long it took. Now something's rotating, and if something's rotating and it rotates a full revolution, what is that time? Can you tell me? You know that time? What is the name for the time it takes for something to do a full rotation? Period. It is the period, and I'll use a capital T for that. This is interesting. Check this out. 2 pi r divided by t. What if I rewrite this as r times 2 pi over period? I hope you're starting to recognize this thing in parentheses as omega. So we're going to find that the speed of the axle is r times omega. That's interesting, but maybe not yet awesome. I want you to take this. Let's say we happen to have a translating thing that's translating at the same rate as it's rotating. So I put little t's on here, and I'm going to add this to this sucker right here and draw what will result. Check this out. On the top, we've got tangential speed of the top from translation, tangential speed of the top from rotation. So at the top, we've actually got twice the tangential speed. That's 2 times VT. For the center, we've got tangential speed from the translation and no speed at all from the rotation, so we have simply VT on the axle. And on the bottom, well, we've got tangential speed that way from translation and tangential speed that way from rotation, and in fact, the bottom is at rest. If the bottom's at rest, then it looks like this. Let's go through this one more time. Watch this sucker move. Notice that the bottom is always still. I'm going to put my ruler back. It makes it a lot easier to do this. The bottom is always still. It's always in contact with the ruler, unless I slip. This is supposed to be rolling without slipping. The bottom is in contact with the ruler at all times, and so it is in fact at rest. This is very hard to accept. When you look at a car tire, the car tire, if it is truly driving, rolling without slipping, I'll call it, well, let's just call it rolling without slipping. If it's rolling without slipping, then the car tire is stopped at the bottom. The bottom being at rest is a critical element of something that's rolling without slipping. So we're gonna make a funny little circle right here, and I'm gonna try to figure out how fast, wait a second, this equation here says the velocity of the axle is r times omega. That's the radius of the wheel times the angular velocity at which it's spinning. And guess what r times omega is? R times omega, we know that to be tangential velocity. This is from the immediately previous video. So that says the axle velocity must be the tangential speed of spinning. That's the same statement that's present right here. Look at this. Oh, purple, purple. Tangential speed. What if we translate at the same rate at which the top would be moving if we were simply rotating? I'm going to say that one more time. What if the tangential speed of rotation were the same as the axle speed of translation? In that case, we would get this picture right here of rolling without slipping. Rolling without slipping is an awesome special case, and you're going to see it all the time in physics. Goodbye.
All right, rolling without slipping. Yeah, rolling without slipping. Let's try one. Let's work on it here. Okay, so I've got these two gears here, right? I've got gear D, I've got gear A. Well, actually, point A is the interface between gear D and gear A. So the portion AOB, right? So this thing right here, right? AOB of the mechanism is actuated by gear D at the instant shown, has a clockwise angular velocity of 8 radians per second and a counterclockwise angular acceleration of 40 radians per second squared. We want to determine the tangential force exerted by gear D. We want the components of the reactions at the shaft. Okay, so let's think about what this is doing. All right, so this portion, right, this thing, AOB, right, this is rotating and has a clockwise angular velocity, right, so this is going to be rotating clockwise. So somebody going this way. We'll draw a picture of this in a second, but I want to talk about what this motion actually looks like. If this is spinning this way, right, these are sharing the same axis of rotation, right? This bar has the same axis of rotation as that gear, right? So this bar is also going to be rotating this way, right? The bar is also going to be moving. This whole thing is being actuated by gear D, right? So this is spinning, causing this rotation, and we've got an angular acceleration in the counterclockwise direction, right? So our angular acceleration is the other way. Sorry, so let's draw, right? So what kind of problem is this, right? Let's start there. What kind of problem are we supposed to be doing, right? So typically our choices are Newton's law, momentum, energy, or momentum or work energy, right? Those are our three cases that we typically have. But we've reset everything, right? And now we're just in Newton's law stuff. This is a Newton's law problem. How are you supposed to know that? They ask you for forces. You are asked for three forces here, right? The tangential force at A, right? Exerted by gear D on gear E. And the components of the reaction at O. And O is a pin, so that's going to have an X and a Y component. Okay, so let's start with our free body diagram. And so, as always, we start with a free body diagram, FBD. I'm going to do this gear here. Yeah, center. You get something that looks like this. Okay. Where I've got point A right here. This is point O in the center. This is point B right here. I know this distance, right? I'm told the distance of this is 0.4 meters. I've got the distance here, that's 0.12 meters. In terms of forces, right, I'm going to draw this up here. I've got the weight of gear E. I've also got the weight of OB, that shaft. I've got some reactions at O. I'll call these OY and OX. And I have some force here, right? How do I know that the force is pointed down that way? How do I know? Let's throw this in here too. Normal, tangential, and so how do I know that that's the case here, right? That that's going to be pointed down. Well, remember, we're told that we've got a counterclockwise movement, right? So if I push it down, it's going to spin that way. Right? I push down with the gear there, it's going to go in the opposite direction. Okay, so I need my kinetic diagram, right? So that's my FBD. So my KD is going to share the same thing. Right, so my KD, if this is point O, here's my bar, here's my gear. Well, the gear's not translating, right? The gear's only rotating, and the gear itself has I sub E times alpha. The bar, though, the bar has IOB times alpha. Remember, we're going to call this my center of gravity. Man, this is not going well. And this will also have MOB times the acceleration normal and the mass OB times the acceleration tangential. Okay, how are we supposed to know that? Well, we go back to the motion, right? The gear itself is just spinning. But that bar is, if we're looking at the center of gravity of the bar, right, the bar is translating as it is rotating, right? It's rotating about point O, but the center of gravity follows this circular path, right, around point O, which means if you looked at this from a Cartesian coordinate system, right, you'd have a different X and Y coordinate as we made our way around, right? So it's translating and it is rotating. It's doing two things, okay? So we need to make sure we keep track of that. I can write down what I know. Things that were told to me, right? I was given the mass of E. If you guys missed it, right, it's there. Right, all of this stuff right here is given. Right? I've already converted everything into meters. I'll convert this into meters. What's case of E? That's the radius of gyration of E. Why is that important? That's going to help us find the mass moment of inertia. We'll talk about that in a second. Right? And that's something that was probably covered in statics that we haven't used again since then, right? And we'll talk about it. Right. So we've got ME, which means that the weight of E should be 39.24 newtons. I've got the mass of OB, just 3 kilograms. All right, how did I get to the weight? What did I do? If I have the mass, how did I get to the weight? And if you have a mass, how do you get weight out of it? What is weight? Okay. What's weight?
The actual value or like what it is.
Like, how would you find it? If I give you mass, how would you get weight? All right. What's the acceleration? To get which acceleration are you use to find the weight? Gravity, right? Mass times gravity. So in this case, it's 9.81, right? Because we're using newtons, because that's meters per second squared, right? Cool. That IE equation is equal to KE squared ME, right? Yes. How are we supposed to know that? You're gonna, if you need, like I think I told you guys this last exam, right? If you need a moment of inertia, it'll either be provided or you'll have a table and you can look it up. This equation is pretty common. If you're given a K value, the radius of gyration, like in a homework or something, you can always use this. You can always use this. We can plug and chug this because we know everything that we need to know about it. And this is 0.028. Excuse me. Say that one more time, Zach. Sorry.
Angular velocity and acceleration of those given.
Yes, they were given in the problem statement. Yeah, the angular velocity and the angular acceleration were right here. One of them is going to have to be negative when we start messing with numbers, right? So I can calculate from this IE times alpha, right? So, or my inertial term here, right? I can calculate that. And that's going to be what? Well, we didn't come up with, well, we know IE, right? IE is 0.0289 times 40 is alpha. So this gives me 1.156 Newton meters. All right, so what else can I figure out IOB alpha? Yeah, yes I can. How? Well, IOB, right? OB is a bar. And the mass moment of inertia for a bar is given, can be given through the following equation. So I'm going to combine both, right? So IOB is 1/12 mass of OB times L squared. That's from a lookup table, right? You would look up the mass moment of inertia of a bar times alpha. Right, so this is 1/12 times 3 times 0.4 squared times 40, which is going to give me 1.6 Newton meters. Sorry, it's supposed to be 12. I didn't write that, Brandon. It clearly says 112. So I don't know what you're talking about. It's not going to be posted on the internet for everyone to see. Let me correct it immediately after you said something. That's not what happened. That's not how I remember it. All right, anyway. All right, good catch. Right, so it's 112. And where does that come from? Right, we could, if we really wanted to, we could derive that, right? There was a whole section in statics where you guys probably talked about finding mass moment of inertia and doing all those things, right? And you have to find like the first moment of the area and the second moment of the area, or you can just go to the tables, right? This is a common geometry, right? It's just a bar. Mass moment of inertia of a bar is 112 ml squared. Some of these, you end up using them so often that you inadvertently memorize them, right? Because certain geometries get used more often than other ones, right? But if you ever forget, you can always look it up. And again, if you need one of these on the exam that's specific, you'll get a table on the back that says, you know, hey, these are the mass moments of inertia. Okay. There's a couple other things here, right? We've calculated everything on our diagrams except OY and OX, which we don't know. But we can figure out what the normal acceleration and the tangential acceleration are. I'm going to do it on the next slide so that there's room. I want you guys to remember normal acceleration is equal to what? Omega squared times r. That's what the normal acceleration is. Tangential acceleration is what? Well, that's just alpha times r. I know r. I know alpha. And I know omega. So I can come up with both of these, right? This is going to be 8 squared times 0.12. Right? Is it 0.12 though? Is that what it is? I'm going to say that it's 0.2. And I'm going to say that this is 40 times 0.2. Why am I using 0.2? Good question. Let's go back here for a second. We're tracking the acceleration of the center of gravity, right? The center of gravity is 0.2 from the axis of rotation, right? 0.2 meters. This distance right here. This distance right here. That's why we're using 0.2. So I can crunch those if I want, right? So this is like 8, and that's going to be meters per second squared. And this one, that one's going to be tougher for me to do in my head. I got my calculator. Give me a sec. 12.8 meters per second squared. Okay, but we're not done with this yet, right? Because what we really need is the mass of OB times A sub n, which is going to be 3 times 12.8, which is going to give me not 24. No, that's wrong. Give me 38.4 newtons. And we need the mass of OB times A sub t, which is 3 times 8, which is 24 newtons. Okay, again, why are we going after these things? Because if we have everything on the kinetic diagram, we know what to set our equations equal to. We have everything on the kinetic diagram, we know what to set our equations equal to, right? So now I know what I alpha is for the gear. I know what I alpha is for the bar. I know what the mass times the acceleration of the bar is equal to, right? So now this should just become us looking at our free body diagram and our kinetic diagram and taking the sum of the forces and the sum of the moments.
I'm sorry, what are the actual forces?
We're trying to find OY, OX, and F. Right? The red forces and the green force F. I just called it F. There's no reason why you can't use whatever you want. Right? But that's just those are, right? Those are the three things we're trying to find. Oh, that was interesting. All right, cool. So here we are, we've got these things, right? So the first thing we're going to do, right, we can do one of three things. We can either sum the moments or sum the forces. What do you guys want to do? All right. Sum of the forces in the x direction or the y direction? Normal direction or the tangential direction? All right, sum of the forces in the tangential direction. So I'm going to sum my forces tangential. This is going to be equal to the mass of OB times the acceleration in the tangential direction. Why? Why not the mass of E times the acceleration in the tangent? Because it's not moving, it's pinned, right? That gear should not be translating. If that gear is translating, we have a major issue, right? So that gear is stuck in place, right? It is rotating in place. It will not translate. If it were translating, then yes, we'd have to include that here as well. But it's not, right? So we don't. And this has to be equal to what? Well, there's only, if we go back to our free body diagram, in the tangential direction, the only force that we have is O sub x, right? That's it. This guy. He's all by himself in the x or the tangential direction, right? So this one turned out to be fairly simple, right? This is just going to be times equal to O sub x. We can solve this directly because we already know that MOB times AT is 24 newtons. Hey, we got that. Fantastic. That's one part done. All right, we need two more things. So what do you guys want to do now? Sum the forces in the normal direction or take the moment? Take the moment. All right, switching it up. I like it. Where do you guys want to take the moment about here? Remember, you can take the moment at any point. The bottom of the bar? Yeah. Why not the pin? Less forces. So Dr. D's general rule of thumb for choosing where to take your moment: always put it in the place where the most forces converge. Why? Because when we cancel the most amount of forces. Okay. So remember, if I put the moment at O, I don't have to deal with the weight. I don't have to deal with either of the weights. I don't have to deal with OY or OX. I only have to deal with the moment generated by F. There's a trade-off here where we'll talk about it. So we're going to do it about O. So remember, just general, do you have to do it this way? No, you can do it wherever you like, but I would highly recommend either doing it at the center of gravity or the place where you have the most forces lining up. Okay, remember, because if a force passes through the point about which you're taking the moment, it cannot produce a moment, right? Why? Because moment is the force times the perpendicular distance you are away from some point. And if that distance is 0, then your moment is 0. Okay? Oh, that was weird. Okay, cool. So I'm going to sum my moments about 0.0. Okay? And if I sum my moment about 0.0, this is going to be equal, and this is something that we covered in class on Wednesday, but we didn't really talk about what it means. The sum of my moments at 0.0 is equal to the sum of my moments at 0.0 effective. What are my effective moments? All right, so let's go back here again. Back to the diagram. All right. So the sum of the moments is going to be from the left-hand side, right? And that's equal to I alpha, I thought, right? Well, yes, but I alpha, that's only if we're at the center of gravity of the entire thing, right? We need to track the sum of my effective moments. So if I'm at 0.0, right, if I'm at 0.0, what is the sum of my effective moments? Well, if I'm at 0.0 here, and I forgot my pointer, so excuse me today. I can't jump that high yet. I'll get there though. All right, if I'm at that pin, the center of the gear, what do I have? Well, I've got IE alpha and I've got IOB alpha. Those are both rotating about that center point, right? So those stay. The mass times the acceleration normal passes through that point, so that does not produce an effective moment. However, the mass times AT is a distance away from O, and that will cause an effective moment. Okay? That will cause an effective moment. What kind? Well, it's pointed in the same direction as the other two. Pointed in the same direction as the other two. What distance is that away? Well, that's 0.2, right? That's 0.2 away from O. Okay? So we can write this. We can say, well, the sum of my moments has to be F times 0.120. Why is it positive? Go back to the diagram again. Right? If I have, right, imagine I'm holding this pen at the center of my rotation and I push downward, right? This would cause a counterclockwise rotation, which would make it positive. On this side, all of these are counterclockwise accelerations. They are all positive, right? So that's why we end up with it the way that we do, right? So if we sum it at O, we only have one thing that we have to worry about, right? F times 0.12. This is going to equal IE alpha plus MOB A tangential times 0.2 plus IOB alpha. Well, we calculated all these things, right? We calculated all these things. What was IE? IE alpha was 0.0289. Right, so this force has to equal this divided by 0.120 plus MOB, well, that's 24 times 0.2 divided by 1.20. And then IOB was 1.6. Right? So all I've done, right, is I've taken these, right, I divided over by 0.12, right, to solve for F. You know what, I'm going to actually do this under here. So that force, 62.97 newtons. Right, so now all we need is the y direction reaction force. And since the only thing left for us to do is sum our forces in the normal direction, right, that's what we're going to do. We're going to sum the forces in the normal. This is equal to the mass of OB times the acceleration in the normal direction. Right? In this case, this is going to equal the force at y, the force at O in the y direction, minus F, minus the weight of both components, right? Because we have to take into account all the forces in the y direction. Nearly all of the forces, except OX, are in the y direction. The good news for us is we know F, we know the weights, and we know MOB times A sub n. So we're just plugging and chugging again, right? We can solve directly for O sub y, right? So O sub y is just MOB AN plus F plus the weight of each of my components. The weights, right? 39.2. And there it is. And there it is. You guys have any questions on this? Where's the tricky part, right? Because there's always a tricky. It's that moment business, right? That moment business is probably the tricky part. Understanding that when we sum the moments, we need to equate that to the effective sum of the moments. Now, could you have, because we know the geometry of the gear, and we know the weight and the mass of the gear, right? Could we have determined what the center of gravity was for the entire system and then track that? Sure. But then you've got to change, right? Then you've got to change your I times alpha terms, because you're still rotating about 0.0, right? Remember, we weren't rotating about the center of gravity, right? You guys have any questions on this one? Nothing.
If you're
What's up? Okay. Time is it? 1:35. All right, so here's the deal. If you don't have any questions on this one, we're gonna do another couple today. About 2 more in here. Okay. You guys are gonna work through this one on your own, and I'm gonna walk around and help you out. Okay. So do we have any questions on what's going on? Any questions on this problem? Yeah, give me one sec. Oh no. Hold on. Maybe not. There it is. Okay. Talking about this one. I can unfreeze it.
So what's the area for this?
So is that
The bot, the EV,
OB?
The bar.
Yeah.
So that's actually like attached to the air rotating.
Yeah. So imagine it's, if you will, like you've got. I don't, all right. So have you guys ever played like a video arcade, that game where it's rotating and you have to knock the prize into the chute? Okay. This is gonna be tough for them. All right, so imagine, if you will, right, there's this gear, right? It's easy to imagine it horizontal, right? So it's just spinning around here, right? And it's got this post sticking up out of the center. I'm gonna stop it. I'm gonna put this bar down on top of it, right? And it's kind of like an automatic. It's almost how your windshield wipers work, kind of, but not really. So I'm going to put this bar on top of this gear, right? They both have the same axle, right? They're both rotating with the same. And so because they're both attached on this axle, they'll both rotate, right? Okay. And they're both rotating. So yeah, so it's kind of like, because they're both, so all right, so almost imagine that right behind this, that you can't see it, imagine these are both attached to a motor, right? And the shaft is going through both of these things, right? That's essentially what's happening. So both of them are rotating with the same speed, right, and the same acceleration at this point in time, but obviously their motions are a little bit different because one is purely rotating and the other one also can be thought of to be translating, right, as we go.
So the IOB represents speed.
IOB represents, so IOB is the mass moment of inertia of the bar, right? So it's a measure of how much mass do we have distributed throughout the bar, right? Essentially what it is. IOB alpha is the inertia of the bar, right? So think about this bar, because it has some mass, right? You need to apply a certain amount of force to it to even get it to start moving. And then we're not even talking about just friction, right? We're just talking like, because it weighs a certain amount, right? You need, in order to move it, you need to apply a certain amount of force. That's what the inertia term is telling us, right? So that's why in dynamic equilibrium, right, it's force, sum of the forces minus mass times acceleration is equal to 0, because we can't assume the mass times acceleration is equal to 0, but if we are equaling our inertia, then we won't move. This is what it's saying. Is that kind of, did I confuse it more?
No, I guess I was just trying to figure out the equation of the 112.
So that 1/12 mass times the length squared, right? That comes from the geometry of the bar, right? So think back, I'm pretty sure when you did statics, Dr. Kong should have talked about doing like centroids, right? It's essentially how you find I the same way that you find a centroid, except that instead of looking at just the geometry, you also have to take into account the mass of the object. One way to think about it is, right, if this were triangular in shape, the mass would be distributed slightly differently than if it was rectangular in shape, right? And so that's going to affect where your center of gravity is. And so it's all about mass distribution. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the mass moment of inertia. Another way of thinking about it is like when you go back to statics, right? If you have a distributed load that's rectangular, right, you can put it at the center of that load, right? You can collapse it all into a single point load. If we do this, we're saying we can lump all of this mass, and effectively is this much, right? Because what should the units here be, right? It should be kilogram meter squared, right? So it's kind of like based on, it's your mass times the area, essentially, right? It's your mass times the area. Any other questions? So let me give you, oh, okay. Thank goodness. I hate when it does that. I have to go very slowly. There we go. Okay. I want you guys to do this one. Now, you guys, this is what we'll do. We'll take maybe 45 minutes. You guys work through this one. All right, I'll walk around, answer any questions as we go. Okay. And then I'll do the next one. I'll make you that deal. Okay. All right. So the extremities of a 4-foot rod weighing 50 pounds can move freely with no friction along 2 straight tracks. The rod is released with no velocity from the position shown. We want to determine the angular acceleration of the rod and the reactions at A and B. Okay. Start with the free body diagram. Would be my hint. Let me give you guys a couple of variables that might be helpful. That one's going to be helpful. Remember the hint from the very beginning of class, right? Start with kinematics. Let's start with kinematics. Try to find your accelerations first.
So range to vehicle. The reaction forces. And the sum of the reaction forces.
Plus, so the weight plus the vertical portion of the reaction forces is equal to the mass times the acceleration. You can't just assume that the weight because as it's moving there, it will be accelerating. Increase. Nothing else can happen is the bar is going to drop. And to the center of gravity will fall up. And that's an acceleration. You say that. Question? So pounds goes to pounds mass, right? So divide by gravity. You're trying to do, instead of keeping them higher, I decide how to rotate, because these different components. You mean for the inertial term? Yeah, on the outside of that? Yeah, it doesn't matter. If you don't know, the general convention is pick it from positive and then you get a negative sign. And just go for the other one. Okay. What's up? So, in this case, we're told that that's friction. It's good to say that it's just gonna have, we don't know the acceleration. So we need to figure that out. How do we get that? I don't think we- So this is a general plan. So if we do this. That's weird, but it didn't go back to the block there. Okay. We use this equation, right? We can figure out that if we know the acceleration of motion, then we can know the final acceleration of the other. So then we use some trade experiments from kinetics. And yeah, and we have friction that we have normal force and some friction parts, right? But if we have friction on there, it means that we don't have enough information to tell, right? But then we have parts that have. You guys got like 20-ish minutes left? 20-ish minutes? Wanted to let you guys know, I saw this when I was walking for lunch today. They were giving out free stampedes from the union, from ASGCU. So, if you guys are into that, we'll grab a free stampede. I'm not for sure. Probably not. They had the big cans too. I had a student in a couple years ago who every day, and after like the 12:30 class, would show up with a giant stampede. Like 3 days a week. I'm like, dude, how many of these do you drink for in a day? He's like, well, Tuesday and Thursday is my long day. So I drink like 2 of these big ones every Tuesday. And I'm like, you tell me that you drink like 4 on those 2 days and then at least 3 already. You're drinking like 7 stampedes a week. He's like, yeah, basically, maybe, not do that. It's probably not great for you. So, not the greatest.
At least it's different flavors that are, mixed up.
And Monster's got the whole cabinet there. All different coffee flavor ones. It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, if you buy them at, they'll put stuff in there for you. If you get it at GCBC.
BCBs can make like mixed drink stampede and out. I've had one time. That was yeah. It was pretty good. Was that one of the new engineering professors you're walking the lunch with the other day?
Down the office?
Yes.
Yes, that's Professor Chris.
Okay. Where's he from?
He just started, he used to work at, oh shit, his name, not Motorola. Mitsubishi.
Oh,
He was
okay.
in Mitsubishi for a little bit. And, started to join the fray.
What's he teaching this semester?
He's teaching the dynamic systems class that I teach. My other class I teach, a senior level engineering class. He's probably gonna be like dynamics. He'll probably teach the same type of things I teach, so dynamics. And you might get his class at some point. Oh.
What's the difference between the MET dynamics and IE dynamics?
The difference is that the ME dynamics also has 4 weeks of statics in it, so they get less time to do all the stuff. That is the difference. The content is exactly the same. There's nothing changed.
I know a guy who switched, I think he took like at least one of the MET dynamics, and switched over here, and guess they're not, you have to take the MET dynamics. If they don't transfer over that well?
It depends. Transfer credits are weird. It would have to be, somebody would have to look into it and see if it was, I think our rule is as long as it is like 90% the same, then we will typically take the transfer credits, but again, I don't really, that's something that he could bring up to Dr. Mosi if he wanted to push the point.
Are there any non-engineers who do golf circuits in the library?
So,
Are there any non
non-engineering degrees in moment traditional life. I mean, that's
Some IT stuff.
yeah. If you get, if you go to the trade school, you get to be a licensed electrician, and, the EET stuff is mostly circuits and wiring. I know Professor Clement has a class where it's just troubleshooting, you do a bunch of broken electronics and help you figure it out. We're gonna take them apart, test them, and see if you can fix them. It's not interesting. There's some IT stuff, but that's gonna be much more, software heavy stuff. But yeah, like in general, like EET is gonna be mostly the hands-on electrical stuff. So there's
Wouldn't that be more the design aspect, where like IT would be more server based and fixing the equipment?
yeah, IT would be more like troubleshooting, helping you troubleshoot issues that you're having on your end. Like on servers or, doing, information security.
There are some negative shit that's not good. Trade school, we're not in school.
Very cool. Like a wire,
Or what?
like a wire, a cord.
So they got a lot of cars. For sure, that's all I do.
Wasn't there a project last year where they worked on F1 car?
So that's a club, there's the Formula SAE club, anybody can join if they want to.
Yeah, there's people working on it, not like the other thing on board. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's people, when I'm in the shop, fortunately, we have the same schedule. So they're they're building the frame right now. For it. It's really small. I don't see how anyone,
So is that the frame, because that could also be, they're making the frame for the human powered vehicle, the recumbent bicycle project, which is a,
I'm pretty sure they mentioned the F1, I think they mentioned the motor out there.
Okay.
They're taking from last year.
gotcha. So maybe they're just making, those cars are weird, because they take, so one of the members has to be the driver, right? And it's always the smallest person, because they need more room. Like, they try to make the frame as small as possible, so like, it's as light as possible, so that so if the driver is smaller, you need less room, you get more room for extras. Yeah.
How do you like talk to those clubs and stuff? They're like, even like career connections with people like that. So there's a lot of people that are available.
I think the ACE Center is the career center, right?
Yeah, so if you get ACE for career center, question like career connections accounts, that's ACE.
Yeah, they just redirecting to the same email.
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
They just redirecting to the same email.
In terms of like career connections stuff, right? I would say make a LinkedIn page, get on LinkedIn. I know that GC wants us to push career connections because that's like the internal in-house thing. But honestly, it's been my experience. I've never had access to career connections, but LinkedIn is in my opinion, is king in this case. Right? Get LinkedIn, connect with anybody you know. I treat LinkedIn as a very protected network personally. If I don't know a person, or I do not accept them as a connection, and that's a personal thing, just because Facebook got really jumped off really fast when I first jumped on it. This is like a professional thing, right? So if you have, I try not to do everybody that I haven't met. Students, like, I love connecting with students on there, because then you guys get connected with my network as well. So it broadens up everything, more issues, more searches. LinkedIn has the most jobs that you can search, hands down. And if you upload a where you can actually fill in LinkedIn applications for some jobs, which will automatically pull your resume information in, so that you don't have to do that part of the application, which is always the most tedious and it's a pain in the butt, right? In terms of clubs, if you want to go to any of the club meetings, all you have to do is show up. So you can get, pretty sure I post them here every week. All the professors every week for engineering and MET classes are supposed to post in my file weekly announcements. And those will have, it's a PowerPoint slide, or PowerPoint slides that has information for when clubs meet on them as well. So we'll check some of those out, and it should give you, this used to be we meet in this room at this time to show up. Now it's we meet at this time for the Zoom link, just for the Zoom link, right? So I know SAE, you're into cars, SAE is always looking for people to help out. They don't, all the clubs really, it's not about how much, it's about showing up and doing the learn. That's what all the clubs want, right? That's what it's about. So if you show up and you're willing to learn and you're active, then that's going to be great. That's the kind of person that you want those clubs. So yeah. So check it out. Notice I probably just posted like weeknight announcements at the beginning of the week. Normally I post them on Monday. It all depends on when they get them to me. Normally on Mondays. But go back in the announcements for class, check it out, see if there should be one for the week. Should be one for week 9 or week 9 announcements, and it'll have a PowerPoint presentation in there, and it should have information about clubs. If not, I can get you, if you guys are interested, right? Specifically in SAE, Dr. Kevin Williams is the one, is the mentor for that. I'm not sure who the club president is this year for that, but Dr. Williams would be more than happy to field any questions regarding that club. He's very involved as a mentor and very integral. All right. Let's get back to this problem, right? Because we hit our time. Although I do think that was a good combo. If you have any more questions on stuff like that, right? Feel free to always ask, right? As Dr. Staggs will tell you, it's worth the price of the question, right? Okay. So what do we got, right? We've got this guy, and I understand, right? You've seen one of these before, and that one was a little bit more straightforward. These types of problems are really, in my opinion, they're really good problems, right? Why? Because they test a bunch of different things at once, right? If you can do kinematics and you can do kinetics, then you should be able to do this. Now, we have to start thinking about these in a slightly different way, right? Because what I said at the beginning of class was we want to start with the kinematics and then work our way up to finding the forces, right? So what are we asked to find? We're asked to find the angular acceleration of this rod and the reactions at A and B. Right off the bat, we're asked for an acceleration and we're asked for forces. Whenever we're asked for an acceleration and forces, we should always think Newton's second law. That should always be where our brain goes first, right? Why? We'll think about the equation. Sum of the forces is equal to mass times acceleration, right? Those are the things we're looking for. But we also know that this is a general plane motion problem, right? This is going to just be a two-dimensional problem. So there's that. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to start the same way we start all of our problems, right? And we're going to do our free body diagram and our kinetic diagram. And here we have it, right? Now there's a couple of things that are in the problem statement that we're going to bring up in a minute when we get there. But there's some information in there that seems like it might not be useful to start with, but turns out to be extremely useful, okay? So what do we have here, right? We've got the normal force at B and the normal force at A, right? Because these are at two different angles, right? Well, yeah, right. The bar itself is at 30 degrees, but then this incline's at 45 degrees. So these are at different angles. And remember, the normal force is perpendicular to the surface that we're touching, right? And if it's perpendicular to the surface that we're touching, that's going to look like this. And we don't have any friction, right? Because we're told that it was a frictionless surface. So the only three forces that we have here are NB, NA, and the weight. Now, your first instinct is going to be to say, well, if I can just sum the forces X and Y, right, I should be able to get a relationship between the weight and the normal force, right? And there's only one X direction force here. So, yeah, yes. But remember the kinetic diagram, right? This is something that's moving. And this bar looks like this, is going to rotate and translate, right? And remember, we're going to track the center of gravity here, right? The center of gravity, which is right there and right here, approximately, right? Because I didn't do a great job of drawing that right on the dot. Anyway, so as this moves, the center of gravity is going to drop down. But it's also going to move out to the right. So, right, and the whole bar itself is going to rotate, right? And because we know that this is a rotation and translation combined, we can do some things here, right? But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to the kinematics, okay? And in the final, right, the way this bar looks, right, A sub A is going to be completely horizontal, right? Why? Because the ground is horizontal there, right? That wheel's going to roll on the ground. A sub B is going to be pointed down at 45 degrees because it's going to be tracking the slope that it's on. And A sub G is going to be some combination of these two, right? Because that's what it's going to be, right? Okay. So I can draw this triangle, right? I can take A sub A here, and I'm going to draw this completely flat, right? And then I'm going to draw this dashed line, right? This dashed line represents the bar itself. And I know that this is 30 degrees from here. Then I'm going to draw the acceleration of V. And I know that that has to be 45 degrees from the horizontal, right? So from there, okay. Well, this leaves me with this angle beta in here, right? What is beta? And beta is going to be 45 minus 30, right? 15 degrees. I can figure out the rest of this because these two form a right triangle with this line. So if this is 30 and this is 90, that has to be 60. And if this is 15 and that's 90, the rest is 75, right? Because 180 degrees in a triangle. All right. Is everybody with me on the trig so far? We good with that? Yes, no, maybe. Yeah. So where do we go from here, right? And this is where that second equation that I wrote on the board comes into play, right? We need to figure out the acceleration of one of these points on this bar, right? Because eventually what we want is we want to figure out this. But let's talk about alpha here, right? This is rotating with some alpha. But what were we told? We were told at the very beginning, right? At the instant shown, there is no velocity, right? The instant shown, there is no velocity, which means if this is rotating, that means there would be no tangential velocity. And if there's no tangential velocity, that means that omega cross r has to equal 0. And that would mean since r is not 0, right, we know what r is, we know omega has to be 0, right, at the beginning, at this time point. And that's going to be important in a second when we write this equation. So AB plus AA, nope. AB equals AA plus AB with respect to A. All right, so remember, this is a general plane motion problem. What does that mean? That means we are going to translate everything. If we're trying to find the acceleration of point B, we're going to translate everything by the acceleration of point A, and then we're going to hold point A fixed, and we're going to rotate everything around point A. If we rotate everything around point A, the remaining acceleration is A of B with respect to A. And normally how we've been writing this, right, is we've been breaking this down into a normal plus a tangential component, right? That's what we've been doing. And so we've been making this negative omega squared r plus alpha r, right? Except what did we just say? At this moment in time, there is no velocity, right? So there is no omega squared r. So we're left just with alpha r. And alpha times r is 4 times alpha here. Now, this seems like it makes more confusion, right? More issues than not. But remember this triangle that we drew on the previous slide. If I can get the previous slide, please. Thank you. Okay, well, look at this, right? I know all of my angles. I've got 60, 45, and 75. I know the length of this is 4 times alpha. So I can get an expression using the law of sines for my other two accelerations in terms of alpha, which is exactly what I'm going to do. Right? So use law of sines. Remember, law of sines tells us what? Well, it tells us that if I have the length of one side divided by the sine of the angle across from it, that has to be equal to the length of another side divided by the sine of the angle across from it, which is equal to the length of the third side and the angle across from that. I know all these in terms of alpha, so I can solve this, right? AA is going to be 5.46 alpha, and AB is equal to 4.9 alpha. Now, why would I want this in terms of alpha? Because I need to solve for alpha, right? Remember, part A was solved for alpha. This is how we're going to solve for alpha. And it seems roundabout and the long way, right? But it's going to get longer, right? Okay. So what do we need here? Right? What do we need here? What we really need is the acceleration of the center of gravity, right? Because remember what we're trying to do, right? If we go back to our free body diagram. Oh, no, thank you. Oh boy. Okay, I got really nervous for a second. Go back to our free body diagram. Where did we draw our inertial term? We drew it at the center of gravity. We want the mass in the x direction at the center of gravity and the mass times the y direction acceleration at the center of gravity. If we are at point A or point B, we do not have that. So we need to figure that out. How are we going to figure that out? We're going to use the same equation we just used again. Because remember, you can do this for any point on a rigid body, right? So if I use A sub G, right, because I'm looking for the acceleration of the center of gravity, that's going to equal A sub A, right? Because I either have to pick A or B. Does it matter? No. Plus A of G with respect to A. So let's look at this. What is this going to look like graphically, right? So I've got A sub A, right? I'll have some vector we'll call A sub G, and then this guy here, that's not supposed to be 90 degrees. It looks like it's 90 degrees. It might not be, right? This angle in here, we know is 60 degrees. And I can take this, and I could break this into components if I wanted. And I could get X and Y from that. So let's talk about this equation, right? So in order to get AG, right, I need AA. So let's talk about just the X direction acceleration here. Okay. Well, AA is purely in the x, right? This blue vector goes just in the x direction. So this is going to be what? Well, that's 5.46 times alpha. What's A of G with respect to A? A of G with respect to A. Well, right, this is just going to be 2 times alpha cosine of 60 degrees.
So just to clarify, how do we get A with respect to A or alpha?
Okay. Question. A of B with respect to A is equal to A of B with respect to A tangential plus A of B with respect to A normal, right? The tangential acceleration is alpha times r. The normal acceleration is negative omega squared times r. But we're told in the problem statement that we start with 0 velocity, right? At this moment in time, we have 0 velocity, okay? If we have 0 velocity, that means that the tangential velocity is equal to 0, which means that omega cross r is equal to 0. So omega has to be equal to 0. So this term goes away. We're left with alpha r, and in this case, r is 4, because we're trying to see the distance between A and B, right? The perpendicular distance that we are away. For the same reason, when we talk of A, we talk about AG with respect to A, right? For the same reason here, A of G with respect to A is equal to 2 times alpha, because it's half the distance away from A as we were before. There's still no normal acceleration. It's multiplied by the cosine of 60 because I want the x component of this, right? And I want to break this into components too. I want the x component. It's negative because it's pointed to the left. If this angle here is 60, well, then that one's got to be 60 in there. We can simplify this through our math. We have 4.46 alpha. I can do the same thing in the y direction. And the only thing we have to worry about in the y direction is 2 alpha sine of 60 degrees. And that's going to give us, right, and that's negative because it's pointed downward. That's going to give us negative 1.732 alpha. So we have everything in terms of alpha. So what we're ending up setting ourselves up to be doing here is we are going to take all of these equations, right, and we're going to have to solve 3 equations with 3 unknowns. That's what we're setting ourselves up for here, right, because I'm going to solve all these equations to get alpha, NA, and NB. Zach, did that clear up why we have the 0 component for the normal acceleration there? Why it's just 4 times alpha? A sub G with respect to A is 2 alpha because it's half the distance away, right? Because it's at the center of gravity from A. So if the total distance was 4, then half of that would have to be 2. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So now we have AGX and AGY. And we can pretty much rock and roll now. Okay, so we're going to calculate our inertial terms, and then we're going to jump into our sum of forces and sum of moments, okay? I would like the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, I told you guys if you needed this, you'd be given it. I was equal to 1/12 ml squared. So that's going to be 1/12 of 50 over 32.2 times 4 squared, which is 2.07 pound foot second squared. I can calculate I times alpha, right? Well, I don't know what alpha is, but I can still calculate it, right? I can get everything in terms of alpha. I can find MAGX, right? So that's 50 over 32.2 times 4.46 alpha, which is 6.93 alpha. And do the same thing in the y direction. That's a G. (2.69 alpha). Now I've got everything on the right half of my kinetic diagram. Everything there is now in terms of alpha, right? And so I'm good to go for, right? I've done the groundwork. I have everything in terms of my center of gravity and alpha. So I can sum moments and sum forces. So what I did first was I summed my moments at B. Does it matter? No, you can do it wherever you want, right? Why did I choose B? Well, it's at an angle, and I don't know. It does, again, doesn't really matter. So what do we have to figure out? Well, this is going to be equal to I alpha. Remember, it's equal to the sum of my effective moments, right? And so if I'm not at the center of gravity, then I have to take into account my mass times my acceleration terms. So I end up with MAG in the x times 2 sine of 30 degrees minus MAGY times 2 cosine of 30 degrees. My sum of my moments, right? Well, if I eliminate the normal force at B, I just have the normal force at A times 4 cosine 30 degrees minus the weight times 2 cosine 30 degrees. This is going to equal 2.07 alpha, right? Just subbing in for I alpha, plus, I'll do my math here, 6.93 alpha minus 2.69 alpha. I messed that up. I think I messed it up. No, we're good. 2 times sine 30 is 1 times 1.73. So, all right, so 2 times, right, sine 30 is 1/2, so 2 times sine 30 is 1. That's why we're just left with MAGX there. In the other case, 2.69 alpha times 2 cosine 30, which is 1.732. So great, right? We can plug in a little bit further here. We have two unknowns in this equation. Normal force times 3.46 minus 50, which is my weight, times 1.732 is equal to 2.07 alpha plus 6.93 alpha minus 2.69 times 1.732 times alpha. This is equation 1, because I have two unknowns in it. Are we going to be able to get these things separated out and have an easy path to solve it? And the answer is not really. All right, so let's go back. Let's go back here for a sec. We've got a little bit of time. We will finish on time. Whoa, that scared me. Not gonna lie. Okay, can I have the slide, please? No, don't you do this thing. Okay. If I sum the moments at B, all right, NA is sine 30 away, okay? NA, the distance, the x distance there is sine, cosine 30. cosine 30 away. That's going to cause a counterclockwise rotation positive. The weight, right, at B, if I push down, the weight's going to cause me to be counterclockwise, or I'm sorry, clockwise, which is going to be negative. All of the other ones are set up as I have them written to be positive, right? Okay, come on. We got to finish this one up. Next class, we'll do another one that I think is a really good problem. And I'll step through it with you guys. Okay. So now what are we going to do? We'll start with, oh, no. Let's start by summing the forces in the x direction, right? And that's going to be equal to the mass times the acceleration of the center of gravity in the x. Well, there's only one x direction force, right? NB sine 45 degrees, which is equal to 6.93 alpha. That's equation 2. I'll sum my forces in the y. MAGY, that's NA plus NB cosine of 45 degrees minus 50 from my weight, which is equal to negative 2.69 times alpha. That's equation 3. I solve them simultaneously. Solve. Alpha is 2.3 radians per second squared. I get a normal force at A of 27.9 pounds and a normal force at B of 22.5 pounds. These are, right, this one's straight up and this one is at 45 degrees. These problems are going to start to get long. They were already long. I know they were already long. They're going to start to get longer. Next class, we'll do another one that I think is a really, really good problem. Right? It's again, it's going to be involved like this. It's probably going to take us a while to step through it. I mean, that's fine. Start trying the homework sooner rather than later, especially since this one's due on Thursday next week. Don't get caught, right? It's due on Thursday for the quiz. Come to office hours Monday from 9 to 11, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday from 3 to 5 p.m. Okay. I know it's a lot, and I know I'm trying to slow it down and have us. The nice thing is we get a couple weeks to work on this. So the next few classes are going to be just working problems, right? So you guys will have some time in class to do some things and have me answer questions directly, okay? You guys have any questions for me? Remember, I will post the solutions to those other problems that we didn't do in class on Wednesday, right? So if you go back and watch the video, you'll be able to see some of those. Have a good weekend. I'm pretty sure we're gonna have a president by the end of the day, but I don't really know. I don't have like any insider info. Remember, whoever you did vote for, if they win or they don't win, we're all still people and treat everybody with respect. And if you're not into politics, then it doesn't really affect your life very much anyway. So I think that we should start having, instead of elections, right, you have to show how good you are at Among Us. And if you can win a giant Among Us like tournament, then you should deserve to be president. Best of 7. It also would be much more entertaining than stressing out about the vote counts every 5 minutes. All right. Have a good weekend, guys. Yeah,
Okay.
yes, I will. You guys can't get rid of me that easy.